Hello, everyone. You're very, very welcome here today, and I'm very excited to talk to everyone about what I potentially talk about all the time is trauma and how our children, how our tamariki, how our rangatahi are impacted in today's society. So throughout this webinar, I will touch basically on some very basic stuff that potentially everyone's already heard, but it's always good to work towards becoming a trauma-informed community and society. So the more we hear it, the more we're going to get it. So thank you for that wonderful introduction, Anthony. However, I am an ITL plate wearer, so I'm going to attempt to navigate some of this stuff, and we might be okay. I think. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay. Let's not go too quickly. There we go. So I have a very strong Scottish accent. If at any point you're missing something that I've said, it is potentially my fault, not yours. Feel free to email myself. At the end, there's my email address, and any questions, anything that you feel we could have spent a little bit more time on, I'm more than happy to email and potentially even have a Zoom call, or, you know, always here for lots of information for everyone. So please do get in touch, either through myself or through Skylight. So let's just look a little bit at trauma. What is it? But before we do, welcome. And I'm so glad to have you all here. And it's evident how everybody is here today that we realize there needs to be some kind of information and change beginning. So throughout this webinar, check in with yourself. How are you feeling? How are you feeling? If you just maybe want to relax your shoulders back a little bit, unclench your jaw, just take it easy. You're here for the next 30 to 40 minutes, so relax. Take a break if you feel that something's coming up for you, something I might be covering that maybe is bringing something up. Just feel free, walk away, take a break. This is being recorded for that very reason, so that you can come back to it at any time. Don't feel you have to go through this journey with me. Questions are welcome at the end or whenever. If you want to type some questions up, I'm not sure how it'll come through on this platform, and as I said, I would also respond to any questions via email. So there we go. I work from a biopsychosocial viewpoint. And just to touch on that, basically, biopsychosocial encompasses the whole person. Western approaches really look at fixing and targeting and focusing and this type of language. Working from a biopsychosocial viewpoint, we look at everything. We look at everything. So if you plant a seed and the seed isn't flourishing, the plant's not flourishing, or it's having some problems, there really is no point shouting at the seed and the soil. You have to look at the water. You have to look at the sun. You have to look at the environment in which it's being raised in order to flourish effectively. So biological. We cannot separate our mind from our body or our body from our environment. Hence why it's important that we look at the entire environment. Psychological, we also cannot separate our emotions from our body. And although sometimes that would be wonderful, it's potentially never going to happen. So biological, psychological. Socio-environmental. The brain adapts to the environment that we are in. It's as simple as that. And looking at these times, and although I don't really want to go into the COVID too much, but looking at that, how people adapt, how we have all adapted. If you look around, who would have believed 2 years ago that everybody would be wearing masks? So we adapt to our environment. It's a perfect example. So what exactly is trauma? Everyone has a different definition of what trauma is. One person's trauma is not another person's trauma. So in order for us to really look at targeting, healing, helping, using compassion in these ways, we need to really understand what is trauma, and it's not the same for everyone. So trauma can be the big T's, which is the catastrophic events, things that we know, earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, that kind of thing. But also, these do not need to be present. And potentially this is where a lot of the work comes in. This is where a lot of the mahi comes in, because sometimes there is no big event, and yet there are signs of trauma and disconnection. So they do not need to be present. I just want to really make that very clear, that if people are looking for the big event, sometimes it's just not there. Trauma can also be, and primarily is, in my opinion, a dislocation from the authentic self. What do I mean by that? I mean a dislocation from the authentic self. Becomes a restriction, a rigidity, an awareness, an internalization of what is happening to you. Things start to change. Coping mechanisms start to become involved. So there's a dislocation from the everything happening naturally, not really thinking about it too much, going day to day. Things start to change, evolve, and not always in a positive way. Trauma is what happens to you. So going back to the biopsychosocial model, it would be lovely if there was no external events that impacted people, but they do. So in order for us to cope, we have to look at what is happening to us. Trauma is what happens inside of you. How do we cope with these things? How do we manage? How do we regulate? Trauma is also about who did you talk to? So if a big T occurs, and a little t could be, who did you talk to? Who did you speak to after that event? Who did you share with? Who did you sit down? Who held space with you? Who was there? Who listened? And not in an adversarial role, not here is an answer, just to sit and be. There is nothing better when we talk about something that we are unsure of, and somebody interjects and says, me too, I get it, me too, I feel the exact same way, or that's happened to me. The majority of the time, you don't even need to finish what you were saying, because that camaraderie, that understanding, that community, and sometimes even held in ceremony with multiple people, it makes us feel a particular way. What is that? What is that? Trauma is who can you talk to? You can speak to people every day on a day-to-day basis. Hello, how are you? Fine, great, brilliant. Who are the people you speak to and tell them the things that are intimate to you, that only you may tell to one or two people? Who is that? Who is in that village? Who is in that community for you? How do I know I have trauma? So when the state becomes a trait, so a state being hypervigilance, something, anxiety, fear, ambivalence, apathy, these are traits. If they are unattended, they evolve into becoming a trait, and they grow. They grow arms and legs. They grow with you if they are unattended, if they are unquestioned, if there is no compassionate inquiry. Some of these traits are hypervigilance, withdrawal, notable behavioral changes. So we all know what happens when somebody changes. Perhaps there's tamariki or rangatahi and something's going on. And you start to see a real kind of noticeable change. The lack of self-regulation. This is all on a spectrum. And these things can happen to anybody at any time. But it's when you stay there. It's when you live there. It's when you move in, when you move the furniture in. The loss of relationship and apathy. When connection isn't paramount, we're not really looking to connect. There's a hopelessness. Why bother telling people? Why would we tell someone? Who's going to fix this? It becomes too big. Flashbacks, nightmares, inability to sleep. Separation anxiety, this is a big one for the tamariki, just the general needing to be with someone, needing that constant companionship. The constriction of play and enjoyment, and the repetitive thinking of the traumatic event, just playing it over, trying to unthink the situation, trying to find a solution, which is difficult. Acting out. So this is primarily based for children, young people, but also for husbands, wives, grandmothers, mother-in-laws, all these people. So acting out, what's going on? So when we look at emotions versus behavior, in particular settings, and especially in society, and not always in school because it's evolving and changing continually, but we start looking at behavior. If we can flip that and start looking at emotion, what's going on? This is not a recalcitrant child. This is not a child with oppositional defiance disorder. What's going on? What's happening? What is the emotion? Now, in order for that to happen, that takes time. That takes time. And it's the difference between two dinners. One is a drive-through and one is a home-cooked meal. Sometimes it's okay. Sometimes you can have a drive-through, there's no problem. Other times you need that home-cooked meal. You need to sit down. We need to look, what's going on? What's the emotion behind it? In order for that to happen, there needs to be the safe space. Now, these are all ideal, optimal situations where we have attuned parent and caregivers who are non-stressed and attuned. In society today, people are busy. People are busy, things are going on. So that becomes increasingly harder and harder. And I don't think there's any surprise that there's a correlation between we see rates of our children's mental health increasing, parents, adults, caregivers, teachers become busier and busier. There's an attachment void somewhere. Charades versus Jenga. When we have young people, I have never known a 5-year-old to walk into a playground and say, I feel somewhat emotionally abandoned. I feel like my parents are creating an attachment void for me and that would be ideal. It doesn't happen. So what do? They do what they have and they use what they have, which is they act out. They are acting out what is going on, which can be classified as behavior. This is a behavioral issue. This is an emotional issue, never a behavioral issue. When we say to children, we would like you to behave in a particular way, these children aren't sitting there thinking, actually, I don't think I will. What I think I'll do is I'll make my life 10 times harder and I'll go against everything this person who cares for me is telling me. That's not what happens. But they cope the only way they can. So what happens when they cannot go to the caregiver, when the teacher is not available, when the caregiver is not available, when the grandmother, the friend, it starts to Jenga. It starts to build up. It's almost like death by 1,000 paper cuts, but these bricks are laid. And at what point do we have the opportunity, time, to go to these children and say, last week when something happened, I didn't get to address that with you properly. Let's sit and talk about that. That's idyllic, and it would be lovely, and it would be almost the answer to everything. However, that's not happening. So they're growing, and these Jenga bricks are building, and none are being taken away. So on one hand, we've got this very solid structure, but let's look at the structure. What's going on with the structure? What type of structure is being built? When we discipline or reprimand or look at behaviors, what we're saying is, to some degree, is come to me with a particular set of behaviors. Don't come to me when things are difficult. Don't come to me when you're angry. Don't come to me when you're furious. Don't come to me when you've drawn all over the walls. Don't come to me when you feel aggressive and violent. So if they can't come to us at that important point, where are they going? And what is the message that they're getting? That you can come to me when things are okay, when you can speak about what's going on with you. Use your words. I hear this all the time. Use your words. Sometimes when you're 5 to 10, there are no words. And if they are using the words, they're not accurate. Because it's only as we get to become an adult that we understand, what is loneliness? What is disconnection? What is isolation? Why do we feel like that? Why do we get FOMO? What's happening there? What is rejection? We are piling all this stuff onto these kids and saying, don't talk to me about it. Come to me with the good stuff. Don't come to me when you've got the difficult stuff. And then we say, what's the problem? What's going on? Why are you behaving in this way? It has to go somewhere. I use the analogy a lot. It's like holding a beach ball under the water. You either have to stay there and hold that beach ball, or you let it up slowly. But if you take your hands off quickly, that beach ball is going to pop up. And that's exactly what happens. These things pop up for these kids. What we don't want is them pushing it back down again. So let's forget about the acceptable behavior only, please. Let's forget about that. Bring everything. Bring it all. If not now, when? If our kids cannot, and our teens cannot express and talk and share, if not now, when do they have the opportunity to do it? At what point are we going to sit down with them and speak? Other than perhaps an hour a week in a session, maybe. So if not now, when? If not you, then who? Who? It's often a question that I ask a lot of my clients as soon as I see them. Who do you speak to? Who do you speak to? They don't have to be a counselor. They don't have to be a specialist. They don't. Who do you speak to? Who are you talking to? Period. At all. The majority of children who say no one. It's terrifying. This peer group that they have, it's important that they are just like them. It's very difficult to go and present how they feel authentically. So who do these kids talk to? They're walking around with this backpack of emotion. Got to empty that somewhere. What lies beneath? This kind of goes back to what I was saying. What's underneath the behaviors? All the things that we all know: sadness, isolation, acceptance, anger, fear, vulnerability, parenting role. This is becoming increasingly common. Taking on the parenting role. Some kids taking on mass responsibility, emotional, worrying about finances, this kind of, and these worries that they potentially aren't going to share with people. So underneath that behavior, I could have filled the screen up with more, but vulnerability. Vulnerability is something, to some degree, which can be classed as a luxury, to have the luxury to be vulnerable, to sit in a space with someone and speak about what the problem is or what's going on for them. it's not a switch. We can't just flick that switch. It takes time. It takes time to sit in conversation and eventually build that rapport, talk, what's happening. So although people ask, vulnerability, resilience, these things, these words, that all takes time. It doesn't happen like that. The village. When there is no village, and as I say, a theme that runs through this is parents and caregivers trying to make things happen financially, emotionally, in a career aspect, in a career field. They're trying to work. They're trying to juggle. We now have COVID to deal with. We now have pandemics. Where is the village? What we have now is a huge percentage of unsupported parents. We have a huge percentage of unsupported teachers, caregivers, grandparents are having to come in, step back into that parenting role because the parents have to go to work. So the grandparents are back in here, which is great because it's multi-generational. That's what you want. This is the ideal. Dr. Gabor Mate talks a lot about that. I think it was Harvard did a study, and they concluded that the optimal society to live in was hunter and gatherer. And although we think of savage behavior, and it was multi-generational, people were there, aunties, children, children playing with children, cousins picking children up, and all together, the parents felt supported. So when the parents feel supported, they can give. It's the empty cup. The attachment void. So part of the class is a small T. I think it's a big T. I think it's a big trauma. It's the attachment void. When there is the void, who does the child go to? Who does the child speak to? Who's there for the child? What happens is they look to their peers. You have insecure creatures raising insecure creatures. And then we wonder where this behavior is coming from. Where is this dysfunctional behavior coming from? There's no one around, there's no modeling. Everyone is overworked, overstressed. There may be a teacher with 30 kids. It's impossible to get around them. And as hard as they try, but the attachment void, there's just simply not enough present adults for our children. The loss of the tribe, the clan, and the iwi, same thing. The dissolution of family, and especially now with the pandemic, this has only been kind of exacerbated, and we're looking through it through a more kind of concentrated lens now, that people are on their own, these little bubbles as such. And on an evolutionary basis, that's not how we're supposed to be. We are pack animals. We need to be together. We don't survive with that attachment. Some of the trauma is multi-generational. We know that. So we're starting from a point of when we're looking for a trauma, and there doesn't appear to be one. There's nothing happening systemically within that family currently. We start thinking about multi-generational stuff that percolates down. So historic trauma, poverty. Again, with the pandemic, this is something that we're seeing more and more of. And we're seeing a lot of anxiety in children where it was never present before. We're seeing a lot of anxiety in the parents. And as we know, children model what they see. So a lot of kids talking about finances and things, and potentially holding back, not asking for stuff, knowing that Santa's coming and worrying about if Santa's going to have enough. Race-based traumatic stress, that is always something that we'll always have to consider, always, first and foremost. Displacement, again, economic insecurity, food insecurity, displacement from homes to try and make ends meet, which means leaving your leaving your people, leaving your friends, all through financial hardship. Some of the negative coping strategies that we see in trauma, and this is adaptable to all ages. So disassociation and emotional numbing. The easiest way potentially to explain it would be something called highway hypnosis. If you're driving home and suddenly you're home and you can't remember how you got there, or you got there too quickly, or you just weren't thinking about it. It's a form of disassociation. The disassociation at times can be incredibly helpful if you are in a situation where you cannot escape. So you cannot fight, flight, you might freeze. And when you freeze, part of that freezing is disassociation. A lot of people call it zoning out or daydreaming, or which there's still daydreaming, but disassociation is a little bit longer, a little bit deeper. And basically it's like the fifth gear of your brain, where there's a lot of things you're thinking about. Sometimes you're overthinking about stuff, trying to work out an issue. So what happens is very gently your brain will say, we're just going to relax you for a minute and just kind of disassociate you for a second. So it's a form to some degree of relaxation. But when that happens all the time, so if you have a child maybe leaving school, going home, it's a stressful environment, that child will very quickly learn to disassociate from the setting that they're in. And with disassociation comes emotional numbing. Then we're asking the child to feel. What do you feel? It's not safe to feel, which is why I had said earlier that vulnerability can often be seen as a luxury to some degree. So emotional numbing, which we can all do, but again, not living there, or just being aware that when we're dealing with kids or adults or teens, lots of the answers are, I don't know, I don't care. And maybe it's because they're just not tapping into how they feel. Why are they not tapping into how they feel? Because it's not safe to feel. Because if they feel, it's not always going to be pleasant what they feel. And they know they have to cope. They know there's no end of that in sight. And who's coming to help? So it's easier potentially to not feel a lot of the stuff. If that continues long term and that state becomes a trait, then we can adapt and start self-medicating. That need to feel something. And that's when people start to develop addictive behaviors or substance use disorders. They create what is called false needs. So they need to feel something. So when we speak to people who have substance use disorder and we ask, what did it do for you? They say, I felt happy, I felt relaxed, or I felt better, or I felt safe, felt like a warm hug. So it's all in the telling. There's a self-medication there. Excessive social media, this is a real problem. It's very easy to turn to, very easy to turn to. It's a time bank, basically, where people can lose themselves. And we have something called proximal separation, where you may have a parent in the room, but they're not in the room. A child may come to speak to the parent might be watching something, they don't know whether to interrupt. Most children just will anyway, but it's that push-pull. Do I not? And also if you can even get them out of their room the majority of the time. And it's, what are they watching? It's a gateway. It really is a gateway to everything. So that social media is something else that is presenting a lot. And a lot of parents are saying, what do I do? What do I do? How do I manage it? It's something else to police in a time when time is restricted. We don't have that time, but it's making that time. Again, further down the road, what's the outcome going to be? Your child is never going to turn around and put the phone down and say, you know what? I've decided that I have a really unhealthy attachment with social media. So I think we should play some more games. I think we should go for a walk in the park. They're not going to do that. They're going to take every minute of screen time that they can. So unfortunately, that's something else for us to police. Risky behavior. Risky behavior is more towards the latter stages of childhood, more coming into the rangatahi kind of behavior. Again, testing, trying to get that feeling. If there is a trauma background, they want to escape that. They want to get out of their own skin. They want to try something new, and risky behavior will always be there for them. Hypervigilance. There's a lot of children who have educational issues at school, and sometimes what's missed is trauma. In an ideal world, we would have a trauma-informed school, we'd have trauma-informed teachers as best as possible, and this would be a real pathway. Hypervigilance can be loud, but it can also be quiet. It can also be internal. And it's like if I said to someone, okay, I'm going to give you this piece of paper. I would like you to read what is on this piece of paper, and I'm going to put you through a ghost train. And by the time you get to the end of that ghost train, I'd like you to tell me what is on that piece of paper. The chances are that's never going to happen. But the thing is, the ghost train changes every single day. They cannot take on information when they are in a defense protective mode. If they come from a trauma background, or if they've left home in the morning and something's going on, they arrive at school, they're full of adrenaline, cortisol. That takes hours to kind of abate. They're not taking on anything. They're thinking, they're processing, they're trying to survive. They're trying to find those coping mechanisms to calm down, and saying to them, here, read, tell me what's going on. What's this? You should have done this. It's not going to work. So that window of learning is so small for these kids. Then when it's time to go home, they start looking at the clock, thinking about it. It starts to ramp up again. So this biochemistry starts kicking in. So it's not even about want. It's about what's going on inside their body. So hypervigilance, these kids, some of them are jumping around, and some of them are very quiet and withdrawn, and it can still go under hypervigilance. Violent behavior, when the bucket is simply too full, it's a spill out, something's going on. There's no need to express how they feel. They're just going to act it out. This goes back to acting out. What's going on? Is it a behavior? Is it an emotion? What's going on there? What can we do? So there is no normal. Normal is cycling a washing machine. And lots of people ask, is that normal? Is that normal? I have no idea what normal is. But what I can say is communicate, 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 communicate. That is the key to trauma. Talk, talk, talk. And when they cannot talk, sit with them. Just be. Sometimes there doesn't need to be any language. Just one caring adult. This is for everyone, for children, for rangatahi, for adults. One caring adult. That's what we need. We need that security of who can we go to? Minimize social media. Comparison is the thief of joy. That is applicable to everyone. Find a therapist that's the right fit for you. Try a few times. If you're going to sit with a therapist, find someone who's going to understand you, who you're really going to connect with. Find your own grounding techniques, whatever that is. Nature, get into nature as much as possible. But again, with the pandemic, it's incredibly difficult. Sleep, anxiety loves people who don't sleep. It loves insomniacs. Sleep as much as you can. Find these kids that aren't getting enough sleep, and potentially maybe even do just a few minutes of sitting down, meditation, just relaxing that brain. Visualization. How are things going to be? What do you want? It creates hope When there's trauma, it creates hope to visualize, because that's all they have is your imagination. Be kind to yourself and watch how you speak about yourself. This is something that I implement to all children, the way they speak. Be kind to yourself. Watch how you speak about yourself, because words have power. Your body is listening to what you are saying. Gabor Mate. Safety is not the absence of threat. It is the presence of connection. And connection is time. And this is something that runs through the entire trauma field. Time, time, time. There is something called the Adverse Childhood Experiences chart that I would encourage everybody to look up. It's Vincent Felitti and Dr. I think it's David Ander. The Adverse Childhood Experiences chart will highlight sometimes just things that are going on. It's a good thing to look at just to get a rough idea. In no way is it kind of prescriptive, but it will give you an idea. A great book that's just come out is called What Happened to You, Dr. Bruce Perry. If you can get a hold of this, it is basically a kind of 101 trauma, what kind of happens, same kind of thing. Just if you don't know it, and it's great to pass around schools and teachers and stuff. But I just want to read you a tiny little bit before they would take any questions or we go on. But the attentive and responsive adult comes to the crying infant. Two very important things happen. The baby feels the pleasure of being regulated after being distressed, and also experiences the sight, smell, touch, sound, and movement of human interaction. The loving sensations provided by the adult caregiver start to become associated with pleasure in thousands of moments when the caregiver responds to the need of the baby. The brain is connecting relationship to reward and regulation. And so when you're attentive and attuned and a responsive caregiver to these little ones, you are literally weaving together this powerful three-part association. You're building a healthy root system for the tree of regulation. So that's applicable to everyone, not just babies, to our young, to our teenagers, to our friends, to our mothers, fathers, aunties, uncles, teachers. When we're attuned, which is just simply listening, being, I think we are on the right path to understanding that even though we've lost the village, we can have a wonderful trauma-informed community. I'm not entirely sure if that is time. I'm not sure how much time we've got left. I'm not sure, Anthony, if we're taking questions or.
We could take some questions. Yes, we have a few minutes left. There was a couple of questions on the chat, Roni. One was around whether there are any resources online that people could be referred to.
Yes, absolutely. So what I can do, as I say, if people look up the adverse childhood experiences, especially for teachers, this is a great indicator of